Yes. So we're still talking about the purpose of the tithe, because I did say earlier that we've got to understand the purpose by which the tithe was instituted, or at least the purpose by which they use the tithe for. That will help us to understand whether it's got anything to do with grace or salvation, or under the law or not under the law. Now, in the book of Nehemiah chapter 13, there's an interesting thing that happened, and I want to read it to you. In Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 10, this is what Nehemiah is saying. I found out that the portion of the Levites, which is the tithe, had not been given to them. Yeah, I found out that the portion of the Levite has not been given to them. Now, the portion of the Levites is the tithe. Now, what did they do because the portion was not given to them? Or why did Nehemiah say he found out? That continue. So the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So over here, Nehemiah comes, he finds out that the Levites are working in Safeway, they're working in Nando's, they're working in Costco, they're working in different places. And the singers, they've all fled to find different work to do. And he realized that it is so because their portion has not been given to them. What is their portion? Their portion is the tithe. So because the tithe has not been given to them, they've neglected the work of God and they've gone back to the field. And that is exactly what Nehemiah did. Each of them has fled. So I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? So if we're talking about the tithing, it's got everything to do with helping people to keep the house of God. And who are those who keep the house of God? The Levites, the priests, the singers, the caretakers, the security men. So that is the argument for the basis of tithe. It's got nothing to do with grace or salvation, because whether New Testament or Old Testament, there will be the house of God. The house of God has to be established, and the house of God has to be taken care of. So this is what Nehemiah did. I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their station. Then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain. So over here, if anybody want to use tithe to talk about grace, probably that person need to re-examine their theology. Because over here, it has to do with something for the Levites and those who keep the house of God, so that they will not neglect the house of God. When Nehemiah found out that they've neglected the house of God, what he did was he confronted the officials. Why has the house of God been forsaken? Then he commanded all Judah to come, and they came. So verse 12, then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, the wine, and the oil into the storehouse. And over here I'll come to the storehouse idea. They brought it into the storehouse, and I appointed as treasury over the storehouse Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah the Levites, and their assistant Hanan the son of Zaccur, and Mattaniah, for these were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and his service. So we see the exact reason why the tithe was instituted. So anytime the tithe was not there, the house of God was forsaken. And we see here Nehemiah rebuking them to bring the tithe so that they will use it for the house of God. That is why when you move to Malachi, God says, you are robbing me. Why? Because you have forsaken my house. You have forsaken my house. You have built yourself houses and paneled houses, and you have forsaken my house. Bring the tithe and the offering into the storehouse, that there will be meat in my house. For who? for those who work in the church, for those who work in singers, for the porters, for the priest, and for the welfare of the church. So this established the basis for the tithing. And over here, there's no scripture that I've read in the Bible that links the tithe to our salvation, and as such, we are under grace, so we have to forsake the tithe. It doesn't establish it that way. The tithe is primarily for the work of God, and for the Levites, and for the priests, and for the singers, and for the porters, for the security, and for the upkeep of God's house. If it's neglected, the house of God is neglected.